Welcome to the Grounded Podcast with your host, Dr. Iman. This is a space where the intellectual meets the spiritual. I'm a professor, scholar of religion, and someone trying to find her footing. Together, we'll seek clarity not in passivity or bypassing, but in intuition, critique, and imagination. Some episodes are just me, reflecting on where I'm finding my footing. Others draw more closely from my own research on religion and spirituality, tracing where I've seen others find theirs. And sometimes we're joined by experts, friends, and even you, the listeners, learning with each other and seeking rootedness together. So wherever this episode takes us, I'm really glad you're here. Let's get grounded. Hello, everyone. It is your host, Iman, and today I am finding grounding in a particular kind of interruptive thought I've been having recently. And I don't know what kind of guide or ancestor is the voice that keeps interjecting this in my head, but here's the scenario. Whenever I sit down to write, create content, post, the first thing that normally comes to mind is what I think somebody else wants me to say. I think this is a result of graduate education in general because there is a lot of emphasis on making sure you're saying the things that your advisors or your professors or your committee will want to hear, or to perform in a way that they are training you to perform. Now, of course, the best of programs, it's a combination of both, demonstrating your knowledge of the field and also propping up and pouring into your own kind of intellectual voice. But now I am no longer in that phase of my life, and I'm really in a moment where I have to start thinking and creating for myself. And so normally when I sit down to do that kind of thinking, to do that kind of creating, I still am conditioned to think, well, what do I think somebody else would want me to say? And then as soon as that thought comes into my head, this interjecting voice comes in and says, well, that might be what they say or what they do, but that's not what I think or what I think I should do. And so that brings me to my grounding question today, which is why I think it is important to study a religion. Now, this question doesn't come out of nowhere. It actually comes from the reality of what we are all witnessing in this moment. And that is truly an attack on higher education, an attack on the humanities. And of course, within the humanities, that is the sunsetting of humanities majors like that of religious studies, which has really forced me to start thinking, how would I answer the question when somebody asks me, why is the study of religion and spirituality important? What would be the answer that I would give them? Now, normally the kind of, I would say, liberal coded, DEI coded language for why the study of religion is important goes something along the lines of, well, it helps people understand the diversity of the world and the diversity of traditions that exist in the world. It helps make people better global citizens. Now, that is not why I think the study of religion is important. That answer to why the study of religion is important actually comes out of, if you remember the episode we did on what's the difference between religion and spirituality. We talked about this guy in this book named Robert Orsi, and he gives a kind of hard and fast history of religious studies. And that idea of that religious studies helps create a global citizen. It helps us see a kind of plurality in the world. It comes out of a moment in religious studies post-World War II, where the study of religion is seen as the study of all that is good in the world. But this is not my answer to why I think that the study of religion is what you would say a social good or something that I think everybody needs to be invested in. My answer to that question is that when you study religion, you study what people do and the meaning that they give to those actions. Once you begin to see the study of religion as the study of what people do, rather than this abstract thing that determines what other people do, you begin to see how power and authority are cultivated, maintained, and resisted in this world. When you can apply the terminology that comes with the study of religion to the kinds of systems of power in the everyday routines that make up your life, you begin to really see how power and authority is cultivated, maintained, propped up, resisted, and imagined otherwise. I think when somebody studies religion, they start studying the world as it is and all the ways that the world has been imagined otherwise and differently. And personally, being at that intersection of being able to name reality while also engaging with people who have tried to imagine it otherwise is a space between the spiritual and the intellectual that I can reside forever. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how the terms that have come to define religious studies have shaped how I encounter and see this world in the everyday, how as a scholar of religion, and yes, I also think that you are a scholar of religion if you are listening to this, how it has come to shape my world. From everything between how I consume reality TV, to how I think about gender, and to how I think about who and what gets the authority to determine what my life should look like. So, for example, scholars who study religion study myths. When you begin to understand how myths work, you begin to see how systems hold power over you by selling you fiction they market as truth. Now, when we think about myth, we often think about fairy tales. We often assume the idea that myths are things that are not true. Now, this is actually a very modern understanding of what myths is, because the equation of myth with falseness or fairy tale is a very modern phenomenon. Myths used to hold a lot of truth and still do, but not to the extent that they once did pre-secularization of the world. But regardless if I know the particular myths associated with a particular religious tradition, if I'm out in the world looking out for myths, then I get to see how the things around me and the systems of power in my life rely on a particular kind of myth. So, what do I mean by this? What's an example? To know me is to know that I am a Real Housewives fan. And I promise, just stick with me. You're not going to actually need to know anything about the Real Housewives to follow along with me here. There is a new franchise of the Real Housewives called the Real Housewives of Rhode Island, which is chef's kiss. If you are on reality TV and have been watching the Real Housewives for 20 years like I have, then you know that these girls have everything that they need to make it to the top. But that is not the point. The point is that they have one of the youngest housewives that they've had in a minute, and her name is Kelsey on this show. Now, Kelsey's storyline is absolutely fascinating to me because essentially her narrative, her entry point into coming into the show, every single one of the Real Housewives cast members has a particular kind of storyline and plot that they play out through the semester. Her storyline and plot is basically she has had a boyfriend and has low-key been a sugar baby for all of her life. She is 31. She has been basically this guy's sugar baby since she was 20. And she talks about how for the longest time, she felt like she was living the dream. She lives in a massive house with like 14 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms. And she is living everything luxurious, everything wealthy about this world. But now she is coming to a point where she is 31. And one of the conditions of this relationship, which is that they are open, it's still really ambiguous what the kind of romantic and intimate relationship dynamic is like in the show. But what she is now arriving at and what brings her on the show is she is now finding that this dynamic is no longer serving her, that having all of the material wealth that she has been provided for through this particular romantic relationship and the kind of terms of this intimacy are not making her happy. She's looking around at 31 and realizing that she doesn't have anything for herself or have anything for her own. Now, this is a common Real Housewives storyline. You marry a rich husband, they give you everything materially that you want. And then all of a sudden, these Real Housewives enter into the scene and they are now on this show because they are trying to establish something for themselves. Now, what always comes next after that plotline, as we've seen with Bronwyn, as I anticipate we're about to see with Shamia and the Real Housewives of Atlanta, is that they're eventually going to use the Real Housewives as a stepping stone of getting their own and then leaving their husbands. Now, I'm not saying that that is going to happen in this case, but what I'm saying is that that is a normal trajectory of this show. But what I think is so fascinating about both Bronwyn, both Shamia, both Kelsey, who represent the millennial spectrum, is to me that these women all represent a particular kind of myth that was sold to millennial women during the most formative years of our young womanhood. And that is the myth of the pick-me. And the myth of the pick-me is that the luckiest of us will be chosen by rich men who will provide us with everything that capitalism has entitled them to, and we will live happily ever after. And what is so great about this show is that it shows the after of this happily ever after. Now, this is not to degrade or put down any kind of relationship dynamic at all. But what I'm saying is a through line across each of these moments in this Real Housewives narrative is that it shows that the myth of the pick-me, the myth that the lucky of us and the most fulfilled of us are those who have been chosen to be provided for by men who benefit the most from capitalism, is not a truth, that it is in fact a myth. And the baseline of that myth
is that capitalism is benevolent to women. That capitalism and extreme wealth, a life of luxury, fulfill your soul, fulfill you spiritually. And what this Real Housewives plotline shows us over and over again is that capitalism, that marriages and intimacies predicated on capitalist models do not actually end up fulfilling these women in the ways that the myth of the pygmy promises them. Okay, now stepping back from the Real Housewives for a second. I'm a scholar of religion, and so I'm particularly attuned to the kinds of myths and narratives that get fed to you. They're out in the water, right? This is not a narrative that any woman in my family grew up telling me, but it was still a narrative that I consumed and was inundated with through popular culture, through media, through music, everything else. And like so many of us during our formative years, we see it as truth. But then we begin to realize that it's a lot more complicated than that. These storylines help us see that this myth is a lot more complicated than that. And it's not the idea that myths are always false. It's the idea that when you begin to know what the myths are for a particular kind of system of worship, like capitalism, for example, then you begin to see who benefits from those myths, where power resides, where authority gets placed. And then you begin to see, as I'm going to keep advocating for, things like capitalism, things like patriarchy, things like consumerism, as all religions that have their own particular myths, and particularly their own gendered myths, like that of the millennial pygmy who gets chosen by the rich man who's going to fulfill her ever dreams, a myth that helps capitalism props itself up as somehow benevolent to women and those of lower social status. And then you begin to see the world for what it is. So again, studying religion is going to make you an even better consumer of reality TV, if that is one entry point or one selling point I can make to you, because it's going to show you the kinds of systems of power that determine our reality, but don't have to. Another thing, if you study religion, you study rituals. And once you understand how rituals work, you begin to see that actually the most impactful social movements and thinkers have all ritualized resistance in some way. Now, when we think about rituals, we frequently think of big ones, communion, the janazah or funeral prayer. But as a scholar of religion, and what scholarship on religion has taught me, is that rituals are not just always these big things, which often place men at the center of whatever the religious ritual is. They often happen according to small, everyday practices that also become ritualized. And so another amazing scholar named Elizabeth Perez talks about how rituals make up micro practices or micropraxes, small, everyday things that people assign larger spiritual and metaphysical meaning to, that are also really important to their own worldviews, their own resisting of the status quo. So, for example, 2 episodes ago, and I'm going to start numbering the episodes actually so I can refer to them by number, I talked about how a huge part of my own work is ritualizing my writing practice. Now, for me, I ritualize that writing practice as a form of channeling, as a form of communing with archival ancestors, as a means for me to resist what I think is a dominating system of power within academia, and that is that knowledge production looks like domination. It looks like invention and aha moments that appear out of abstraction and nowhere and are not grounded in who we are, whose we are, and where we come from. And so I ritualize that practice of writing as a means of resisting that white supremacist mode of knowledge production, as creating knowledge to dominate, as creating knowledge from abstraction rather than based in deeper realities, as creating knowledge through this idea of the genius model, as if our knowledge comes out of nowhere. Or that one's relationship to knowledge should always be about dominating it, intervening it, and trying to always make something new. So ritualizing, creating micropraxes or micro practices around my writing through things like journaling, things like writing notes to my ancestors, are small everyday ways that I try to resist that larger system of power within academia. So as a scholar of religion, I know that small everyday practices can actually be quite resistant to the status quo. And then for myself, I can begin to think about what is the kind of meaning I'm going to imbue into my everyday practices that are going to make it resist the thing that I want dismantling in this world. And that is a beautiful question that we can all use to structure our lives. And that is something that I think is so beneficial about the study of religion, is that you begin to see yourself as a religious subject, as a spiritual subject that has the possibility to create meaning for yourself and assign deeper meaning to your everyday actions. Now, here's another one. Scholars of religion study authority. And when you know how authority works, you start moving in a way that aligns with what you think should have authority over your life, not what you're told should have authority over your life. When I tell you my entire relationship to the Islamic tradition has been transformed by the study of Islam, and particularly the study of feminist Islam and the study of gender in Islam's total recalibration of what religious authority actually looks like. This has been something that has actually truly changed my life and has truly changed my relationship to the Islamic tradition as both a scholar who studies Muslims and as a Muslim scholar myself. So, for example, one book that I absolutely love is Tazeen Ali's Women's Mosque of America. And it talks about the alternative modes of religious authority that Muslim women who founded the first women's only mosque space in America use in order to authorize themselves and authorize their practices, to authorize their ability to have a women's only mosque without men's leadership. And so she talks about how there's a normative understanding of religious authority, right? And within Muslim context, that often looks like being a man. And that is not unique to Islam. Almost all religious traditions place greater authority in men than they do women. It is frequently having Arabic language expertise over English ones. It is having some kind of formalized credential from a place of higher learning and higher education, typically outside of the United States within Muslim communities. So she lays out what is a normative understanding of Islamic religious authority, right? A normative understanding of Islamic religious authority that often falls completely outside of the normative Black woman's religious and everyday life. 1, not being men. 2, English likely being your first language. 3, maybe not having access to the kind of educational opportunities that are going to take you to in Egypt, take you to Saudi Arabia, take you somewhere outside of the United States, and also the kind of economic privilege and resources that one needs to actually obtain that kind of authority. So instead, what Tazeen Ali shows us is how these Muslim women who lead the Women's Mosque of America come up with their own definitions of what religious authority looks like. And in that space, someone has religious authority is someone who has the wisdom that comes from experience. And that's a very Black feminist, womanist understanding. That wisdom does not just equal knowledge or studying something. That wisdom equals knowledge plus experience. For example, if I am a male religious leader, am I going to have wisdom on abortion? No, because I am not a birthing person. So I will only have knowledge about it, by studying what the law says, what Islamic law says, but I'm not going to have wisdom according to womanist understandings of religious authority and also the understandings of religious authority within the Women's Mosque of America that say that in order for a religious authority to have the right to determine abortion laws or counsel on abortion, they would need to have both knowledge and experience of being a birthing person. And so just imagine that. Just think about that, for example, what it would mean to place people who actually have knowledge and experience of something as the most authoritative. What would it mean to place, for example, Black women, Black birthing people, Black doctors, Black nurses, Black birthing people who have had interactions with the healthcare system as the head of the Department of Health? See how when we begin to place people who have actually experiences with the systems as being in charge of the systems, we can't even think about how those systems like American healthcare that has the highest rates of Black women, maternal mortality, what that system would look like if Black women were actually at the helm of leading it. Another aspect of what authority looks like, according to Tazeen Ali in this book, is that religious authority also looks like deep vulnerability. Being able to be vulnerable about the things that you have gone through in your life, about your own emotional state, being honest about who you are and what you've been through, as giving somebody authority to speak on something. Imagine if we saw the people in our lives who were the most vulnerable with us, maybe the ones who cry the most, maybe the ones that we think have the most emotionally dysregulated responses to scenarios where emotional dysregulation should actually be the right response. What if we place those people as having authority over the very thing rather than privileging a kind of emotional distance and calmness over something? Just think about that for a minute. That's a totally different understanding of what authority is, not just within mosque spaces. I cannot even think of a single everyday system of power institution that does not also replicate a kind of authority that actually explicitly deprivileges lived experience and vulnerability and things like emotion. And so for me, this has been deeply transformative, thinking about a womanist, a Black feminist kind of understanding of authority that also Tazeen Ali traces through the Women's Mosque of America and Muslim women's religious authority in those spaces. Because for me, it has made me refigure who I think is an authority in my life. It's not the people who I think just have knowledge and wisdom over something. And I'm an academic. I 100% see the value in and elevate knowledge in the study of things, right? I'm over here advocating that we all study religion, but I'm also advocating that everybody studies religion because everyone also has an experience with it, which actually is then going to produce them having actually wisdom about it. When I started understanding how authority works, I started moving in a way that aligned with what I think should have authority over my life, not what I had been told should have authority over my life. Scholars who study religion study how knowledge is produced. And when you understand how knowledge is produced, you start producing your own and finding meaning and purpose in knowledge that people have told you there isn't any in. For example, relating it back to the point on authority, a core Black feminist, womanist thought is that experience equals wisdom. And so one of my favorite kind of figurations of this is Audre Lorde's understanding of the erotic. And sometimes I think, do I need to start quoting other things when I talk about alternative knowledge systems that's not just Audre Lorde? But I'm like, wow, I really feel like no one has theorized in the kind of way that she has when she talks about, for example, the erotic. Now, she talks about the erotic as that deep sense within you that says, this feels right to me. Think about those moments in your day when you're like, oh my God, this just feels so right to me. Like I can spend forever doing this. This feeds my soul. For me, I have recently discovered that I love bike riding. And I've just been thinking to myself, why have I not been biking everywhere in my life? The fun that I get from biking, that feels right to me. But big car wants everybody to have a car and driving all the time. But anyways, when you start structuring your life around this feeling of this feels right to me, you start rejecting what she calls supplied states of being. That is all of the ways that you are told what is good for you and what you should be doing, which are almost always ways that make money for and are good for the few, the richest of the rich. And Lord's formulation of the erotic is deeply powerful because it says that knowledge is produced internally. And Lord's formulation of the erotic, of this feels right to me, is so revolutionary because it tells you that knowledge actually comes from your interior, from yourself, from within your body. In a world where we are told knowledge is always external, is always taught to us, it does not come from within. It is always something we have to go seeking for outside of ourselves. And as Lord puts it, when you start listening to the knowledge that is within you, you start accessing meaning in your life that doesn't just come from consumerism and materialism, but from what she calls a deeply psychic and spiritual plane. And I don't know about you, but that's the plane where I'm always trying to go. I'm trying to go there. I'm trying to have one foot in this material world and always one foot in the spiritual, metaphysical. One of my favorite thinkers, Key, the pink philosopher on TikTok, doesn't call it the supernatural. She calls it the other natural. I'm always trying to have one foot in the natural and one foot in the other natural. And according to Lord, you only get to that place when you start listening to what is within you. And I can't say enough how this very podcast is a product of this nagging, deep internal feeling that I have always had and that I've had since I have been in higher education and really since grad school. And that is that my intellectual space, my teaching space is both the classroom, yes, but is also outside of it. And it is also auditory as much as it is written. Not to say that writing in the classroom and higher educations are not my spaces, because those are my spaces, but they are not my only spaces. And that comes from a deep knowledge within, because that is not taught to you when you're getting a PhD. No, it's not. But that knowledge of this being a space and something that I need to do and have to do, so much so that the thought of it doesn't let me rest. And then I've only stopped having this kind of sense of urgency around it now that I have been actually doing what I feel like I've been required of me in terms of doing this podcast and just being more public about scholarship, thinking, and intersections of the spiritual and the intellectual. That entire line of thinking is a product of, my own inner standing, my own inner knowing, as the kids like to say. And so I only know that the interior, that the self, can be a space of knowledge through my own studying of religion and Black women's intellectual history and Black women's religious history. So these are all just examples of how I think the study of religion changes you as an intellectual, as a spiritual being having a human experience. That the study of religion is a social good because it helps one see the world as it is, and it turns your attention to all the possibilities of what it could be. That to study religion is to study critique that's not rooted in despair or ambivalence, but is rather rooted in all of the ways that people have imagined this world otherwise, that there isn't just one way of being in this world. When you study religion, you start to see all the different ways, especially when you commit yourself to studying religion that is not Christianity or not exclusively Christianity. To study a religion is to study how the spiritual and the material are one and the same and have been thought of as one and the same for so much longer than they have been seen as secularly divided. And more importantly, when you study religion, and this is my big plug, you study how the status quo is maintained and how the status quo has been resisted. When I think about students who study religion, when I think about people who study religion, I encounter and I see people who can name the world with a precision that I have never seen before, but also who are deeply engaged and knowledgeable about all the ways of being human that have existed, resisted, and also have been suppressed. So today, I am leaving this episode actually feeling extremely energized, thinking to myself, wow, I hope this was a good pitch for why I think the study of religion is important. But just stick with me, because low-key, every single episode, I am trying to convince you all of why I think opening our eyes up to the study of religion and spirituality, of thinking at the space between the spiritual and the intellectual, is going to give us so much. Now, what that so much is, I think is boundless, and there are many answers. And I think it's also something we all have to answer for ourselves. But I promise, and I know, I said I wasn't going to make any promises on here, but I know it is going to give you something. So if you liked this episode, as always, I ask that you please share with a friend. If you have a question you want me to answer on the show, please slide in my DMs and follow me on social media. That is IMANABDK on TikTok, Instagram, and now I'm on Threads. And I will see you guys back here next week on Monday. Bye-bye.